Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Excellent. I have no PowerPoint, so I'll just read. I'm honored to be here. Thank you very much for this invitation. And before I begin, I just want to put a plug in for Quo Vadis Humanitas. So it just came out in English a day or two ago, and I'm halfway through, and I find it's really marvelous so far. So I would encourage everyone to take a look. It's a document of the International Theological Commission that just came out. I'm also a small plug or request if anyone has any good suggestions for literature on the understanding of what a computer is. So I'm trying to become more articulate about metaphysically what a computer is. I'm trying to start with a Pascaline, so the first or one of the first mechanical computers calculated by Blaise Pascal, and trying to trace an argument from there through the electronical computer. And then who knows if I can have any understanding of what a quantum computer is. So if anyone knows of any good introductory level literature about what a computer basically is, I'm just trained philosophically and theologically and as an amateur pop science guy. Okay, so I'll just begin. I believe one of the dangers today with so-called artificial intelligence is that we will commit injustices while at the same time hiding our responsibility for them. With these new technologies, it is possible to release into the world many effects while masking or hiding the moral agents behind them, and thereby making it difficult to ensure accountability and promote what is good, true, and beautiful. Given the extension of so-called artificial intelligence into almost every domain of human action, we could be on the verge of establishing massive social structures that are terribly unjust, insofar as they spring from unjust and hidden human decisions and condition us to make additional, more unjust and hidden decisions. To help us avoid such a danger and support the success of this project here in Pasman and Catholic U, today I wish to make three proposals. I hope these contribute to our desire in this kickoff conference to reflect on and here I quote the conference presentation, to reflect on the social acceptability of machine decisions, ways to ensure transparency, and the manageability of AI's black box character. First, my first proposal, I would like to propose that we all try diligently to discipline our speech and vocabulary to protect ourselves from philosophical errors that make clear thought and action more difficult. And forgive me if I sound like a cankerous philosopher here, but I think this is important. For example, I think we should not speak of machine decisions, no more than we should speak of artificial intelligence. In fact, when I use the expression, I always try to qualify it as so-called artificial intelligence. A machine does not make a decision. The surge of electricity channeled through transistors is not a decision-making process, nor more than one domino decides to fall after the next domino. What happens in the machine is always an effect of physical and chemical law, not a choice. Despite our inability sometimes to trace or predict a physical output, there is no decision being taken through such a physical process. Our task, therefore, is not to make machine decisions socially or morally acceptable, because there is no such thing. Unless we also want to make rain gods and garden fairies acceptable, we should not try to push society to think about machines as agents at all, let alone as moral agents. So rather than speaking about a decision, let us speak about something like an output. And I acknowledge there may be better alternatives. Output is the one that makes sense to me. Similarly, let us not speak about machine learning, since metaphysically speaking, machines have no intrinsic form or substance, let alone a soul or intellect capable of learning. Let us speak instead about what is just physically more descriptive, about perhaps like narrowing or pruning the physical and programmable connections or pathways that yield outputs. Rather than speaking about rewarding a system which has no soul and therefore no desires and which therefore cannot be rewarded, let us say something like confirming or solidifying the pathways of output. These are just examples. I'm sure that there are many similar terms that we should examine if we want to speak precisely and therefore in the most helpful way. Second, striving to speak with philosophical precision will promote transparency. Clear and correct speech makes it easier to understand what is happening. If we speak correctly, it will be easier to recognize our responsibility for the effects we bring into the world through these tools. This leads to my second proposal. The morally just use of so-called artificial intelligence will involve the social and legal acknowledgement of true decision makers and their responsibility. Since machines do not make the decisions, we must identify those who do. The real agent, the real decision maker, is always the human being behind the creation and use of the tool. Discerning responsibility is necessary to promote justice. The classical tradition of Western philosophy and theology has consistently connected freedom and therefore personal responsibility with the definition of justice. For example, St. Anselm of Canterbury, to take just one representative of the tradition with whom I have some familiarity, defined justice as a state of the free will. In Latin, justitia est rectitudo voluntatis recta servata propter ipsam rectitudinem. So moral justice, more or less, exists when a will chooses to align with the truth for the truth's sake. Moral justice does not happen accidentally, and it is not an inanimate state of affairs. Of course, we can speak of just and unjust circumstances or inanimate objects, but only in a secondary sense. Catholic social teaching, at least, recognizes the justice and injustice of social conditions, systems, and tools, or the structural dimension of problems and their respective solutions. Nonetheless, this social justice is considered to be a development of general justice, or the justice governing social relationships, that is, the relationships between human beings. In question, therefore, is never simply the impersonal reality or the social structure or the thing on its own, but rather the structure as the result and condition of human decisions. The pursuit of justice will therefore always involve tracing social conditions, systems, and tools back to the human beings responsible for them. Similarly, the pursuit of justice will always be motivated by concern for the freedom that is shaped by those impersonal conditions, systems, and tools. A machine has no will or agency. It cannot be just or unjust, morally blameworthy or praiseworthy. When we attribute too much moral significance to our conditions, our systems, our structures, our tools, we are at risk of overlooking the real source of injustice, namely our own will. And here's sort of, the main point I wish to communicate. This is, I think, one of the great temptations behind the anthropomorphization of so-called artificial intelligence. If a decision can be attributed to the machine, then the machine can serve as a scapegoat, and we can ignore our own responsibilities as creators and users of technology. And I just say this as an aside, but I think it could be significant that some of the leading technologists in the world who perhaps lack some familiarity with the tradition, they are very ready to ascribe a high level of anthropomorphization to these tools. And conveniently, it would seem to eliminate their own responsibility. They're the creators of these tools. And so it doesn't surprise me that they're the ones attributing the highest level of agency to the tools they create, lest they have to foot the bill, morally speaking, for whatever it is that the tool does. Admittedly, we can make a decision more or less consciously and with more or less proximity to its effect, but it is still our decision. When I go hunting, for example, I don't go hunting, but suppose I do. Not that I have anything against hunting. But when I go hunting, for example, I could decide to shoot rapidly and randomly and just hope for the best. I may not deliberately decide to shoot an innocent bystander, but I still made the decision to shoot wildly in a potentially populated area. And therefore, I should be held accountable. Similarly, if I set up a bot that wildly shoots out fake news stories, I should bear responsibility for these lies and their effects in the world. I should also bear responsibility even if my decision is far removed from the effect in time or space. For example, if I manufacture and sell a hunting rifle that does not fire in easily controlled, safe, and consistent ways, I should be held responsible for putting such a dangerous tool into the world, especially if I hastily brought it to market without the due diligence necessary to understand its dangers and inform its users. Similarly, if I produce and sell a digital technology that is not easily controlled, safe, and consistent, I should be held responsible, especially if I could have known about the dangers if I had done the due diligence that prudence requires. This leads me to my third and final proposal, which concerns the problem of ignorance. This third proposal is an exhortation to recover the moral distinction between vincible or conquerable and invincible or unconquerable ignorance, and to recognize that we are still responsible for making prudent decisions even when we are ignorant about certain circumstances. I want to begin by tentatively suggesting that we avoid attributing an exaggerated significance to the apparent novelty of the black box character of so-called artificial intelligence. I understand, and I'm certainly open to be correcting. I'm trying my best to get up to speed with all of these things. But I understand that this black box character results from the countless lines of code and impenetrable physical processes that are involved in every computation. Today, we are simply unable to trace how an input concretely leads to an output. However, perhaps this black box character is essentially no different than what we already face with many other tools. For example, I admit that I have no idea really how a car works. I know I can turn a key, there's my input, and then get the output of a functioning vehicle. But I have no idea how the input concretely leads to the output. The car I drive is, for me at least, a black box. And yet I am still held responsible for ensuring its output has a positive effect in the world. Of course, today the difference between a tool like a car and so-called artificial intelligence is that the concrete processes in so-called artificial intelligence are inaccessible for everyone, and not just for uninformed users like me. Nevertheless, I suggest that the essential moral problem is the same. We're still talking about a connection between ignorance and responsibility. Why should the black box character of a technology have any bearing upon our moral responsibility for its use? In classical moral theology, we could consider the distinction between vincible or conquerable and invincible, unconquerable ignorance, as well as the prudence of taking an action in a state of ignorance. For example, if social media companies could have known about the negative effects of technologies designed to manipulate the brain and increase use, they should bear proportionate responsibility for these negative effects in the world. If there was no way for them to know, then their decision was not deliberate, and thus they cannot be held morally responsible. But even if they are not held morally responsible, perhaps they should still be held socially or legally responsible to the extent required by solidarity. For a healthy society should encourage its members to accept their responsibility for the common good. If a company profits from the sufferings of others, even if it did not intend those sufferings, it seems that company should share its own profits to alleviate the sufferings. It is important to note that, at least morally speaking, this is not simply a question of ignorance, but of responsibility for ignorance. It is not simply a question of whether a company knew, but whether a company should have known. That is, whether their ignorance was conquerable, vincible, or not. It is also a question about discerning when our concern for the common good should slow us down in a state of ignorance. Are leaders sufficiently zealous in trying to overcome their ignorance? When ignorance is invincible, unconquerable, are they prepared to accept responsibility for the potentially negative effects of their products? Or do they lazily and greedily turn a blind eye to potential problems to push their product more quickly and cheaply to market? And do they limit their prudence to ensuring their ability to protect themselves from any negative effects, and thus ignore their responsibility to the common good? Because of its black box character, the creation and use of systems involving so-called artificial intelligence involves ignorance. How much of this ignorance is truly vincible or conquerable, and to what extent should we oblige ourselves to conquer it? And when ignorance is in fact invincible, what other discernment must we make before pushing a product to market? Is there a proportionate benefit to pushing it to market in the case when our ignorance is unconquerable? And crucially, how can we respect each other's moral dignity as persons and thus hold each other accountable, whether morally, socially, or legally, when our ignorant actions result in harm? Such questions should be considered when managing these new technologies. In considering these questions, I suspect we will all be greatly helped by a deep reading of Quo Vadis Humanitas. I'm still working through the document myself, but I have to say I'm very excited by it. It seems to me to offer a theological synthesis under the category of total vocation, and that puts personal responsibility, spirituality, and the adventure of life and the moral conscience of each individual person at the center of all our efforts. And I think that's exciting and very helpful. Let me conclude now by summarizing a few suggestions for those who draft policy and law. This will take maybe just another minute. We should speak in ways that train our own intellectual habits to recognize and live in the truth, namely the metaphysically insubstantial reality of a machine, as well as our own moral responsibility for its effects in the world. Number two, we should limit the creation and use of tools to those who have the ability to assume responsibility for their effects. We do not let companies sell certain lead products, and we do not let children drive cars. So let us also create and regulate digital tools in ways that promote safe and responsible use. Number three, we should insist upon human agency, upon transparently identifying those who are to be held responsible for turning an output into a decision in the real world. At the same time, we must avoid temptations to scapegoat and therefore recognize the complexity of assigning proportionate responsibility, especially in situations involving a multiplicity of agents in the creation and use of such tools. To conclude, I believe an essential element in the success of this project involves clearly stating the connections between causes and effects. We must identify and ensure the transparency of all moral agents. Thank you very much for your attention.